As the Bulls clashed and the Hulk raged, P. Diddy subbed, Kimmy was caged, the Findy made a double, and the Brit played swapsies with a Finn. Alo topped the lap times and Seb waltzed on to win. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of the Wall of Champions, an F1 podcast. We've got a change in the driver lineup tonight, so joining me is Luce, as usual. Evening, Luce.
That was terrible, Webby.
Oh, I tried so hard. I mean, I stressed over that for hours.
How long did it take? Like 30 seconds?
8 lines, at least 12 seconds. And enter was the most used key. And also joining us tonight is Matt. Evening, Matt.
How are we all?
Good. Flying high after watching Alo set the fastest lap of the race.
Yeah, I got a bit excited there for a bit.
Yeah. It's like the car had pace for once. It was great.
I had a warm feeling inside me, which I haven't had for a while.
That sounds a bit X-rated and not safe for work, so... Well, it was. We may as well kick straight into it. It was an interesting race. I mean, Hungary tends to be one of those races that throws up a bit of a result every year. And I guess going into this race, I think you were saying it in the last show, Luce, that if we got to Hungary and Mercedes beat Ferrari legitimately on pace, the championship was over. In fact, I believe you also said the crazy words that this was Ferrari's most important race for 10 years.
Yep.
More so than, like we said, championship deciders in 2010 and 2012.
2010, 2012, they were underdogs. And if we're honest, they shouldn't have been in the title fight at either of those races.
All right, then what did you make of Ferrari's general performance at Hungary?
Well, they started the weekend a bit slow, but as it went on, they obviously got stronger and stronger, and obviously they locked out the front row. And in the race, I don't think we really saw how fast they could be. Obviously, in the early stages, Seb still obviously had his problem, but pulled a little bit of a gap, but then it got worse and it got smaller to the Mercedes. So it's hard to say. But obviously, they were the quicker car there and they needed to be.
Very good. All right, and then turning to you, Matt. Obviously, in qualifying, we saw it was 2x2x2 in the first 3 rows. But I thought it was interesting this weekend, the battle between Renault, well, the one car of Renault, which qualified P7, obviously went backwards with Hulkenberg had a 5-place grid penalty for a gearbox change. But the battle between Renault and Honda for 4th best team. What did you think of that battle over the weekend?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that since Renault introduced that new floor diffuser, other tweaks in Silverstone, that the chassis is a lot better than it was at the start of the year, not just in qualifying and in the race. And so yeah, it ended up being really close between McLaren and Renault, but also Hulkenberg's only qualified 6/10 off Red Bull, and we know they've got the same engine, so chassis definitely stepped up in the last couple of races, and that made it hard for even someone as good as Alonso to out-qualify Hulkenberg. But yeah, it looks like a good battle that maybe, you never know, could continue to the end of the year.
And obviously, we've seen Stoffel Vandoorne has been struggling to keep up with Fernando through the first half of the season, but you know, here we are, legitimately the first track that Fernando's been at. Obviously, they were competitive Monaco. Fernando wasn't there, but the track where the car was really competitive in terms of where it's been. I mean, obviously, McLaren's used to being at the front of the field over previous decades. But did it give you heart to see Vandoorne was only 3.5 tenths off Alo in Q3?
Yeah, to be honest, I was a bit disappointed he was 3.5 tenths off in Q3 because he was a lot closer in every other session for the whole weekend. So I think he probably didn't have the best Q3 lap, or Fernando just did a really, really, really good lap. But ignoring Q3, I think the whole weekend he was really, really close to Fernando, and Fernando's pretty good around here. Won his first race here and been competitive all the time. So it's halfway through the year, and like all young drivers, I guess we've got to give them a chance. We tend to give them their last rights way too early, probably. But Vandoorne's definitely coming good. So yeah, I was definitely encouraged to see that he was close to Fernando, which is a little bit different to some of the other drivers that have more experience and aren't quite so close to the teammate.
Yeah, and just turning to you now, Luce, obviously we saw that the Red Bulls, I mean, obviously Ferrari looked like they had about 1.5 to 2 tenths on Mercedes in qualifying. It was actually really, really close, even though it was a formation finish for the top three teams. The times were actually really close, because I thought the interesting thing was that the gap between Ferrari and Mercedes was the fact that there was less than a tenth between Hamilton and fourth and Verstappen and fifth, and Ricciardo was only a fraction slower than that. So Red Bull and Mercedes were quite close this weekend. Did Red Bull do what you expected them to, or were they actually a little bit disappointed considering how much they were talked up going into the weekend?
They were talked up quite a bit. Probably when you look at all that talk and you think of obviously how they were pace-wise, it's probably a little bit disappointing. But I think again we probably understated the how good the Mercedes is, and then I think also with obviously Verstappen being so close to Hamilton. Obviously, I think Hamilton in qualifying he just wasn't his normal self. He's obviously complaining about tyres pretty much throughout every session at some point, and the only lap he got together was the last one at Q2. So I guess that sort of explains some reason why the gap was even as close as what it was. But then again, in the race we saw, if Verstappen hadn't have had his he knocked Ricciardo off the road and didn't have that 10-second penalty, that would have been an interesting fight.
I think people make a lot of Hungary and Monaco, and probably when we go to Singapore, how they have less power effect than all the other tracks, but power is still very important, even on these tracks. It would still affect the amount of downforce that you can carry, even in a small way. And you can see that Red Bull weren't quite there compared to Ferrari or Mercedes in the end, and McLaren also weren't quite there compared to, say, Renault, where you would expect the McLaren chassis to be better, but they still couldn't quite out-qualify Renault, so power is still important, and that might explain a little bit why Red Bull were just a shade off where they probably hoped they would be.
Yep. Yeah, I remember I've had a couple arguments with people over the interwebs on Reddit with people that just think that power on these types of circuits doesn't matter, and they can't be further from the truth. It matters everywhere. It can get perfect example is if you have a video game, let's say iRacing, for example. If you come out of a corner and stuff it up slightly and you run, let's say, maximum downforce, you're not gonna be able to get that time back. Well, if you've got less downforce, you can get that tenth that you dropped and still turn it into a faster time, so to speak. And I think that's where Mercedes get obviously a bit of time and keep up with cars when their drives are a bit off.
And we're only talking half a second here. Max is half a second off pole. It's really not heaps. It's starting to get big, but it's not really that big at half a second. Yep. And yeah, I just think until the power situation's a lot closer, then Red Bull are always going to be a touch off.
Yeah, well, they've always got it. They always have to compromise their cars. Not in some ways, having such a high downforce track, it actually hinders them a little bit.
Yeah, because you see on tracks we saw it in Baku, and you will probably see it in Spa, where you expect them to not be as competitive as, say, here, and you'll find that they're probably the same distance behind. And you're like, well, how does that work? But having a good chassis like that means they can trim the downforce off on those fast tracks and still be competitive in the twisty parts of the track. And the lap time delta ends up being the same, when you would expect that they'd be further behind. So it's really, the balance between downforce and power is really weird.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we saw last year that Spa was one of McLaren's strongest races, and everyone was expecting him to be really weak. So that's definitely true. So yep.
Red Bull in 2014 as well. You saw Ricciardo won. So
after that, Nico hit me.
Yeah, but Nico was still in the race after that.
Yeah, of course. All right, so I wanted to swing focus a little bit just before we move on to talking about the actual race and just to finish off the qualifying. It seems that Force India are an interesting team of late because they've been actually qualifying quite poorly. At Hungary, they were 12th and 14th respectively, Ocon from Perez. And yet they still seem to be getting themselves into the points. So... And conversely, you have Williams, who are qualifying really poorly, and they were both out in Q1. Obviously, we had the Massa Di Resta situation, but it's a tale of two cars, right? That has the same power unit. They're both qualifying. They're both qualifying poorly. Clearly, one has a setup or a downforce problem at the moment, being the Williams. It seems it's had that since they had the upgrades prior to Austria. But what do we make of Force India qualifying well outside the 10? And yet, when they spoke to Bob Fernley after qualifying, said, "Oh yeah, we'll get both drivers into points, no problem at all." How can they be so confident? And what do you make of that? Are they just relying on DRSing and using engine power to overtake? I'll start with you, Matt.
I think, yeah. So they're 12th and 14th on the grid, but I think if we go back a step. The last two races have been tracks that are definitely more aero dependent. So regardless of the engine they've got in the back, their chassis is not up to scratch to get them further up the grid on these sorts of tracks. So you'll find in Spa they'll be back in the top 10, no problem. They'll be 8th, 7th around there.
And how do you? And I was going to say, and what do you think of Williams? Are they just look like they've just lost it, like with their new upgrades prior to Austria?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened. They put the upgrade on the car and they just completely lost. And I think I read today that they're going to try a massive setup change at test that's going on right now to try and sort it out because quite clearly they were pretty good in Baku, and on the podium, and 2 races later, they're nowhere. So I think Williams is an upgrade sort of problem. But both, if you go back to those 2 races, I think the Force India and the Williams have very similar car characteristics in that obviously they don't have the downforce of the top chassis, but definitely have the best engine. And I think on the 2 tracks that we've just seen, that's why they've been a bit weaker than they were before.
Okay. And before I turn to you, Luce, I'll add another team that's about that mark in qualifying. Well, actually, there's 2 if you consider Toro Rosso and Haas as well. Is it for you? I mean, if we look at Force India, moving into the 10, obviously car characteristics, as Matt was saying, but Force India is also a team that has a pretty good driver lineup, whereas Williams have Massa, who is a bit beyond his peak, and they've got Stroll, who has been struggling, regardless of his podium, versus Toro Rosso, who has Kvyat, who's accident-prone, but Sainz, who's an absolute gun. I feel like it's an interesting dynamic between you can even add Renault to that list, with Force India and Haas, Williams, Renault, Toro Rosso. I find it interesting because it really does look like the cream's rising to the top amongst those driver groups. What do you make of that?
Is this pointed at me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, certainly is an interesting driver mix. Obviously, yeah, Williams is their drive is just obviously my thoughts have been heard before in that I don't really rate Stroll all that highly. He's got the podium and points finishes, but he's still not really been convincing. Massa is past it, and then Force India got 2 really competitive drivers, and both of them have sort of put their hands up to possibly go into obviously a top team at some point in time in the future. But I wouldn't count. Obviously, you've got the torpedo at Toro Rosso. He's got the talent. He just needs to get his head right, and then obviously Sainz, and then obviously you got the way their cars are. You'd think that Williams would be well out in front of Toro Rosso, but they're not really blowing them away. And then with the lineup that Force India have, No, they're just about locked in, and I reckon they're lucky that Hulkenberg hasn't got a more competent teammate.
Yeah. So I did added Haas to the list. So they're looking at the constructors' standings. Obviously, Force India is miles in front and fourth. They're 60 ahead of Williams. They've got fourth in the bag at the moment. I know they're making noises about challenging Red Bull. My only response to that is good luck.
No chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have to say that.
Yeah. But so they got a big gap. But then there's now only 2 points between Williams and Toro Rosso. And I think that Toro Rosso are going to overhaul Williams sometime within the next few races. I know we've got Spa and Monza coming up, which are going to be tracks that suit Williams more than they suit Toro Rosso. But that gap's getting very small, and Williams risk falling down to 6th in the championship again. They've probably got enough over Haas, but if what you said is right, I mean Renault's got 26 points, and that's all Hulkenberg. So if you had a Palmer getting like half of those points, they would actually be P6 in the championship ahead of Toro Rosso. So I mean that's a pretty big deficit for Renault, and that's why you can't help but feel they've got to be looking at a replacement. After the summer break for Palmer, who was competent over the weekend, apart from his stupid crash in practice. But again, no points.
Well, I saw a stat that you might think he had a good weekend and all that. He kept it out of the barriers and didn't do anything silly, I guess. But once he let Hulkenberg past, in I think 25 laps, he was 19 seconds behind him.
Yeah,
now,
he was.
That's unacceptable.
And
we
just got a live comment. Carlos Fish says hello there. So hello there, Carlos Fish. Feel free to shoot us a question, and we'll deal with it a little bit later in the show. And what do you think of Renault, Matt? Do they have to make a change, or can they accept being 8th in the championship this year as a one-car team?
It comes down to money, doesn't it? If they want the money from finishing higher up in the constructors, or they want Palmer's money. An interesting
thing to think of before I let you continue on is that after a very good race at Hungary, McLaren are now only 15 points behind Renault. Both teams are maxing out their components, so they're both going to suffer from more penalties as the year goes on. If McLaren can become the fifth best car on the grid, they could actually start eating into that Renault lead.
Yeah, I think Renault pretty safe, to be honest. By the time McLaren get their shit together.
Well, actually, so Carlos Fisher's just asked a relevant question. What we're talking about, he's asked what do we think of McLaren's the double points finish. So I'll let you go with that, Matt, because you are the McLaren fan. So
yeah, so I think it confirms obviously that the chassis is good. For people who didn't think that prior to this race, so the chassis is good and up there with probably in the top 4 somewhere. And the Honda engine is getting better. It's obviously to a point now where it's probably not quite the same distance away from Mercedes as it was last year. I think it's a little bit worse. But it's definitely as close as it's been this year to that level. And now it's really down to when Honda can introduce the new spec engine that's supposed to upgrade the combustion chamber and the injectors and turbocharger and all the rest of it. That should bring another 30 to 40 horsepower and put it on to the level of roughly Renault. And then I guess we can see what McLaren can do, but it's down to when that happens. Could be around Suzuka, which is a long, long way away.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think McLaren did the best they could on the weekend, which was great. And there will be small upgrades from Honda, probably Spa, Monza, just mapping and things like that. But it's not enough at the moment without the engine upgrade to turn McLaren's season around so that they can catch Renault, Haas, Toro Rosso. I think they need the Honda engine upgrade before they can do that.
Of course.
Good.
Yep.
Good news is the car's good. All the parts are working. They put more new parts on the weekend, and Jonathan Neal said they will work problem. So it's looking up.
Yeah. So I guess the only problem really there is that every upgrade they take from now on is going to yield them a penalty. So on every component. So that I think that makes it tough. But Luce, just to carry on with the point that Matt was just making, then I want to ask you a slightly different question. Matt mentioned that the car looks like it's probably the fourth best chassis in the field, but the Renault looked pretty good around Hungary as well. How do you think the McLaren and the Renault stack up against each other as chassis, taking the power units out of it?
It's honestly very difficult to answer.
Have a go anyway.
Oh,
The McLaren is better. It's obviously better.
Peanut Gallery, look out. You're trying to influence
I'll
Lewis's answer.
probably lean a little bit more in the McLaren favour simply because of how well it did at Monaco. But obviously, that floor upgrade for the Renault is certainly lifted it up.
Well, it brought together all their upgrades, right? They're like their upgrades from the last couple of months. The floor upgrade was the thing that really that was the final part of the package. So from Silverstone, at Silverstone and then at Hungary, the car looked very good.
Yeah, but also Alonso only qualified a 10th behind Hulkenberg. Like with the Honda compared to the Renault is not 1/10.
Yep, no, that's fair enough. But it is ALO. So you have to judge the drivers on normal.
Well, no, you have to judge the lead driver because you can't compare anyone to Palmer.
And Hulkenberg and Alonso were neck and neck through qualifying. So all things being equal on the engine side, you'd have to presume that McLaren have a better chassis.
And we'll finish off the McLaren bit with Carlos Fisher said, I feel like McLaren Honda should have had more than 11 points. It's not going that well. Definitely should have had more points, but reliability and pace has not been their friend. Mainly reliability.
Yeah, Alonso was on for points probably the first 3 or 4 races, even if it was one in some cases. But he could have easily finished 7th in Spain or China. He was on for another 7th in the wet. So they've been on for reasonable sort of results, but yeah, just I think early in the season the Honda let him down, and then probably after Spain haven't had the pace to really get decent points, but slowly getting better now.
All right, so we'll move on to the event of the race now. We're going to get stuck in qualifying all night. So obviously, we'll start with how it happened chronologically, but turn to Max Verstappen up the inside of Ricciardo. It's questionable whether Ricciardo thinks the move wasn't there. Verstappen obviously thinks it was. He locked a brake, speed into his teammate, punctured his radiator, gave him a puncture of the rear left. Pretty clumsy, Lewis?
Nah, that's an understatement.
All right, then describe it without understatement.
Well, I think obviously Ricciardo was right. The move just I don't even know if he was just sort of feigning or just. I just don't know what he was thinking. He just completely ballsed it up and obviously just outbroke himself. And then, even though Ricciardo gave him a generous amount of room, still ran into him quite heavily. It was just a clumsy attempt at a pass. And on lap 2 and on your teammate, I don't understand what he was thinking.
It wasn't an attempt at pass. He was just trying to put his car in a position where maybe he could hang on around the outside in, I don't know what the next corner is, turn 4 or the right-hander after that.
Yep.
Just to give himself a chance. But what happened was he obviously got shoved a bit wide at turn 1. Probably his tyres were a touch dusty after that. And then braking behind Bottas into turn 2 there, he just couldn't really pull it up. So he was just trying to brake as late as he could to keep Daniel on the outside rather than letting Daniel go around the outside. But he just dirty tyres, to downforce, and the front's locked pretty easily for him.
Did he deserve the penalty that he got?
Yes.
Yes.
Look,
I think you go.
Bottas did just as clumsy things earlier in the year and didn't get penalised. It's about time that someone got penalised for something stupid.
Were you surprised to see an incident between teammates get penalised like that?
I was surprised to see the incident get reported full stop. And then I was further surprised that other incidents on lap 1 and later on early in the race weren't even investigated.
Yep.
Yeah, I think when we were watching the race, Webby, and I was like, "Where's the consistency with other incidents?"
Yeah, I think
from the year. Like, I think there's been Kvyat's been into people. I can't remember if Kvyat's got penalties for all of his, but
most of them. But then you have, of course, I consider the Bottas incident with Raikkonen at Azerbaijan to have something to have been at least in somewhat similar.
Yeah, I agree.
And Bottas, there wasn't even any talk of Bottas getting a penalty, really. So I do feel it's quite inconsistent. And then, but it's weird because they allowed Hulkenberg ran Grosjean wide at turn 1. And I know that they're a bit lenient with incidents that happen at turn 1. But then, of course, we saw Magnussen do the same thing to him. And I think it was clearly revenge because Magnussen had been on a radio complaining about Hulkenberg.
Yeah, and that's what gets me a little bit. The Magnussen one is deliberate. Kevin opened the steering to get rid of Nico.
He slowed down and then opened the steering. It was obvious.
Yeah.
Nico was driving around the outside and would have continued around the outside had Kevin not opened the steering on him. So he basically threw his car at him by opening the steering, and Nico had nowhere to go but off the road. And that's a deliberate forcing someone off the track. Whereas Verstappen didn't do anything deliberately; he just made a clumsy error. Magnussen got 5 seconds, and Verstappen got 10 seconds. So it's a bit weird.
Yeah, it's quite inconsistent. But I mean, obviously, the one who hurt the most for that was Ricciardo. Had good pace, good challenge for a podium. Instead, he's out of the race. A third into a lap. All right, so Carlos Fischer's added that he said he felt like the move was pure inexperience. He was trying too much to go on the inside, but then Daniel went in front of him. Verstappen should have let him go. I think we all agree that Verstappen probably should have lived to fight another day rather than spearing his teammate off. And I'm sure that's what the discussion in the Red Bull motorhome was after the race.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right, well, we'll move on from that one. The question I wanted to ask you guys, and I think we actually discussed this while we were all sitting there watching the race, was the fact that obviously Seb had his issue, and I think it was obvious by the fact that Fernando Alonso got the fastest lap of the race, that Ferrari never showed their true pace during the race because Seb, I'm sorry, Matt, but clearly Seb was struggling for pace, and Kimi was bottled up behind him. First of all, kudos to Kimi for not complaining too hard on the radio, merely just saying, not demanding to be let pass, but saying that Seb needed the speed up because he didn't want to get into a battle with Mercedes. But my question is, and I'll shoot this to you first, Luce, because I know as the Raikkonen fan, did Ferrari risk losing that race, or do you think that they knew that the 1 second bubble was going to save them behind once Mercedes got into dirty air behind them?
Well, I think they probably saw how Hamilton was behind Bottas, and if it wasn't for the fact that Bottas let Hamilton pass, he would have been stuck behind him all race. And Hamilton, as we saw, he flew, he was almost a second a lap faster than Bottas after that. So, and the Ferraris were just a little bit faster than him. So if he couldn't get past Bottas on pace, it was probably the right idea. It was probably, even though I was a bit uneasy about it, about sort of holding station like they did, obviously, I think with hindsight, we've seen that it was the correct decision. And then also, when you think about it a bit more, that the Ferrari just had enough pace on it that it probably didn't worry him all that much.
All right, very good. Matt, I'll throw to you, but I'll add an additional bit of the question that I didn't ask Luce. Do you think that if the roles had been reversed and it was Kimi leading from Seb, that Ferrari would have done something different?
And Kimi had the problem?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Given the championship situation, they would have had to let Seb go and get the maximum point. But they did the right thing with how they handled it for once.
I know there was much consternation between us because I was adamant that Ferrari risked losing it. I got proved to be wrong. That's fine. I can accept that. But I was adamant that the rate of knots that Mercedes were catching Ferrari that they were running the risk of Kimi actually being caught and then Seb being overtaken as well and then actually losing the race. But as it turned out, people know more than I do.
The risk was there. We saw it. Obviously, the Mercedes for a period there was significantly faster. But yeah, it just got within the 1.5 seconds, and it just... Even when Kimi didn't have DRS, like, he was still able to hold off Hamilton for a few laps there.
Yeah, I was banking on Kimi having the DRS, which would save him. But you're right, he didn't even need the DRS. It was just the way the aero rules are, and this track with the middle sector being the way it is, and the last corner, it's pretty hard to follow with even a second a lap quicker. So Kimi didn't need the DRS in the end, but I think Kimi's a testament to how hard it is to pass around Hungary, because he's been second and probably right up the backside of the leader for at least 4 or 5 years.
So let me career, so. Yeah. So let me ask a question, and I'll ask you first up, Lewis. Does that race at the Hungaroring solidify for Ferrari that keeping Kimi Räikkönen for next year is the right decision? Because can you imagine that Verstappen would have sat behind Seb like that?
Verstappen would have sent it up the inside and wiped them both out. I'm just about adamant of that. I'm just about adamant that someone like Verstappen would have tried something silly.
So is the Hungarian race a race of good timing for Kimi? For first of all, Kimi, if Ferrari hadn't already decided, which I'm sure they have, but we're fans, we're allowed to speculate. A good timing for Kimi, where he reminds them to say that he's a good soldier. He'll do as he's told. And do they risk putting someone like Perez in the other car? And do we think that Perez would have just sat there like that? I for a second don't think Perez would have. Perez would have done the same thing as you said Verstappen would, which is set one up the inside, trying to overtake, trying to prove himself.
Well, obviously, we've seen in the past, like Kimi's a bit of a team player. He's not gonna rock the boat, which is the main reason why he's still in that seat. Someone like Perez, like we've seen obviously at McLaren in 2013, he bumped into Jenson Button every time he could, and then even like this year, he's had incidents with Ocon. So
they touched again into turn 1 at Hungary.
Yeah, so I think I don't think if like they were going to change drivers, I don't think it'd be Perez, and Ocon's under contract, so it'd have to be like they'd have to promote a younger driver, or maybe they shock move for Ricciardo, but I don't see them changing drivers, to be honest.
All right, and I mentioned it was a race of timing, Matt. So do those points, we know that Fernando said he was going to make a decision about what he's doing next year during the summer break. Does that result for McLaren come at the perfect time for them? Because obviously they're quite keen to keep Alo in their car for next season. Or are they just going to benefit from the fact that there's no seats opening up for him to go to?
Yeah, I think that result won't make any difference to Alonso's thinking. I think his thinking is, firstly, what you just said, the other seats, the only possible spot for Alonso really is Ferrari.
Well, I'd add Renault to that list, but go on.
Yeah, you could add Renault in theory, but I think he wants to win, and Renault's a sideways step rather than a step up, really. But I think the situation at Ferrari with Seb, from what I read today, Seb only wants to sign a 1-year deal with Ferrari, and probably that suits Ferrari at the moment because they're probably after Verstappen or Ricciardo,
or Hamilton,
who are all off contract at the end of next year. So if they're happy to give Seb a 1-year deal, knowing that all these other top drivers are coming onto the market the year after, then everything's status quo, including Fernando. But if they want security for 2-3 years, then Ferrari should give Alonso a crack again. But I think Fernando's in his last contract, so
I mean at the end of a 3-year deal from next year, he's going to be 40. Although not that I doubt his ability to perform when he's 40, but you know what the sport's like. The sport writes drivers off of age now. Like everyone expects drivers to come in when they're 18 and as soon as they're mid-30s, it's like, well, he's old, put him on a shovel and throw him out. It happened with Webber, it happened with Button, it's happened with Massa, probably with Massa for more reason than the others.
Fernando's a special guy. I think he could do another 3-year contract and drive the same as he's driving this year. But it is his last contract, regardless. So I think Ferrari probably better off waiting till next year to change the driver lineup, and that goes for Seb and Kimi.
All right, no worries. Well, and just one more thing, Luce. Do you think that Fernando Alonso is definitely on the grid next year? Curve question.
Which grid?
Does that answer my question?
No, it doesn't. Next year will be. I reckon it'll go one more year, and if next year it's trash again, I reckon he might even leave halfway through the year.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't put that past him. If
it depends on who McLaren end up with engine supplier and how they're performing, and what Honda do, whether Honda try and, if the Toro Rosso deal goes through and McLaren end up with Renault. The only option for McLaren is Honda or Renault. Ferrari and Mercedes won't supply them.
Right.
And that will affect how they go next year, really.
And what do you think the chances are that Red Bull are going to be happy with a Renault deal to McLaren?
Well, the only way a Renault deal for McLaren will happen is if Toro Rosso get Honda.
Yep. And
Red Bull wouldn't mind Honda going to Toro Rosso, because then they've got their finger in two pies.
Yeah.
The Honda pie and the Renault pie, and they'll just pick the best one for Red Bull the year after.
And Red Bull as a company won't care if Toro Rosso finish down in the constructors. It doesn't bother them too much. Whilst it bothers Toro Rosso greatly. Okay, so we've been asked another question, which is, do you guys think that the Sauber should be better with the engine that they have, considering that they have a Ferrari engine? I feel they should be better. That actually plays into something I mentioned later in my notes, which was that the Sauber Honda deal is off for next year. Just remember, Carlos Fish, that the Ferrari engine that Sauber have is last year's Ferrari engine. It's not this year's Ferrari engine. That next year they'll move to a 2018 power unit, and they will be better. But they've been quite consistent this year, I thought. Like they just don't have a power unit to be competitive with anybody. How do you rate their year, Luce? Obviously, it's poor. They're the worst car in the grid, but chassis-wise and driver lineup-wise.
Chassis-wise, it's hard to say. I wouldn't really. It's being a Sauber, I wouldn't really rate the chassis all that much, and their drivers. Pascal Wehrlein, his value for me has dropped significantly this year. He's not had a very good year. Obviously, he started the year injured and missed a couple races. But then when he has, he's been a bit accident prone, and Ericsson's looked, fairly competitive alongside him. For someone who's meant to be a up and coming, potential Mercedes driver, he's not looked the part.
Is Marcus Ericsson going to be the driver that keeps, weirdly enough, Pascal Wehrlein out of a top team, Matt?
I think Pascal Wehrlein spinning off every 3 practice, every couple of practice sessions, probably do that. I think the superstars destroy their teammates in those lower cars. Wehrlein should be destroying Ericsson if he's to be, a Seb, Kimi, a Lewis, a Fernando one day, and he's not. So he's heading towards the mid-tier driver level, and I don't think Mercedes are too interested in that, especially when they've got Ocon, who looks like he's a cut above that. So I guess in a way Ericsson's relative performance and Wehrlein's kind of half year is going to mean that he doesn't quite make it to a top team. And I heard that he might go to Formula E to drive for Mercedes there.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
That would be interesting, I guess, for him.
And what did you make of Sauber's decision to cancel a Honda deal for next year? It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, well, maybe McLaren would want to cancel Honda's deal, to be honest. But I think Sauber wanted the couple of things. The old management were going to give Honda a lot more than just the engine supply deal. They were going to collaborate on other levels. maybe a driver in there as well.
I heard
And,
Matashita was due to test for Hot Sauber a little bit later in the year.
Yep, and also I think there's another spin-off. I think maybe in the road car side, or there's another little bit of help that a little bit of collaboration that Sauber and Honda were going to do. But obviously the ownership changed. Well, not the ownership. The team boss changed, and Manisha was out. And then the other part of the story was Sauber wanted or needed McLaren's gearbox to be able to run the Honda. And I think McLaren are, umming and ahhing about what engine they want next year, and Sauber are, wanting to get on with it. And if McLaren aren't with Honda, then Sauber don't have a gearbox.
Yeah.
So the Ferrari deal was, here, we'll give you the latest gearbox, and we'll give you a driver as well.
So you would expect Giovinazzi or Leclerc? Giovinazzi or Leclerc will be in that seat next year?
I think Fred Vassar's a very big Leclerc fan.
I think it's a certainty. Leclerc's like what Bianchi was. He's destined to drive for Ferrari, I think.
But he's fastest right now in the test, or he was an hour ago.
Yep.
So, and I think Giovinazzi's been in the wall a couple times too many this year for him to get the nod over Leclerc. I think if he'd stopped after Melbourne qualifying, his stock would be a bit higher than it is now.
Yeah.
But he's had a couple of races since then and a couple of practice sessions and eaten a bit of concrete. So Leclerc would have to be the favourite to sit in that seat next year. And of course, a 2018 Ferrari power unit versus a Honda power unit, I think it's a no-brainer.
Of course. And Lewis, what do you make of all of that?
Yeah, I think Gio's probably damaged his stock a bit by having a few accidents too many. Every time he gets in the car, he seems to write it off. But Leclerc, obviously, from what he's been doing in F2 has been insane. Like just about every race weekend, you're hearing of he's come from the back of the field and past 15 cars to win a race or get on the podium in insane fashion. I mean, he looks better than what Bianchi did coming through the junior formula, so it wouldn't surprise me if we see him in the car next year.
All right, no worries. We've been asked another question here, which is Magnussen is honestly the most immature driver on the grid. The interview after when he said "suck my balls, mate," that was the thing that gave him that trophy that Hulkenberg gave him, and with an apology for kind of swearing. I quite like Magnussen's attitude most of the time, where he's a bit un-PC, and what he said about the halo was very interesting. But I'm not much of a fan of drivers butting heads in the pen. Did you see that video, Liz?
I've seen the GIF. I haven't seen the video.
That's a GIF, mate. Did you see it, Matt?
GIF.
Yeah, I've watched it multiple times because I thought it was hilarious.
Remember back in 2000? What was it? 2000 and was it 2008 with Massa and Hamilton.
11.
Yeah.
11. Oh, it was 11, wasn't it?
11.
Yeah. Yeah, where it was like a good job. You crashed into me again.
Good one.
Yeah,
huh?
he tapped Lewis on the shoulder and he goes blah blah blah. Lewis goes, "Don't touch me, man."
That's right.
Which is different sort of reaction. I think.
And then nothing beat Felipe's sarcastic thumbs up afterwards. That was just the best ending.
Yeah. I think. Look, to answer Carlos's question, I think, what would you do in that situation? Someone's come up to you and basically said you're a loser. And he came back with the wittiest comeback he could think of. All right, the cameras were there, but you're not thinking about the cameras when someone's having a crack at you.
To be honest, I probably would have said something worse than Magnussen in that situation. I mean, I guess it's tough to say. Magnussen knows what he did. And he knows.
For me, that makes him a dog more than what he said. His behaviour on the track is more dog, and he's next to Verstappen and right up there with how he defends. If you look back through all his 2014 season, and
I think it's interesting. We demand that we complain when we get Robotas, And Kimi doesn't talk much, and Hamilton comes across as a bit fake a lot of the time. I think the only one you're not critical of really is Seb, except when he avoids questions, but at least he gives lengthy answers.
Oh, I don't know. He's got a lot of people that call him a crybaby and the like.
Yeah. But so we ask these guys to show us some more personality, and Hulkenberg's definitely a guy who does that. And Magnussen's definitely a guy who does that. It's drama. People like it, but at the same time, I'm like, I wanted to be professional, so I'm really torn on it. What do you think of it, Luce?
I personally like that there's a bit of added drama and a bit of human element in it. Obviously, for a few years it was just all a PR fest, and you'd never see anything from the driver. So obviously, a bit of a spat's always an interesting way, or interesting to see. But
it's good to be reminded that guys who was even scrapping for no points, that's how much it means to them.
I think a lot of fans that complain about this stuff sort of need to realise to get to where they are, you've got to be... Like, if you think you're competitive at something, these guys are insane. You've got to be at another level.
God, imagine being that competitive and you're Jolly Palmer.
He's not. I think the problem with him is he's not competitive.
You need to have the self-belief, and I think spending 5 years in GP2 isn't good for your self-belief.
No, I'd agree with that. I think that it's not. I feel like there's too many young driver programs out there nowadays, and most of the drivers we get into the sport, like we were just talking about Leclerc before. Talking about Bianchi, Verline, Ocon. I mean, these are guys who are coming up. Red Bull, all the Red Bull drivers, and they were the first ones at it. When they get their young driver programs, and by the time the drivers hit Formula One, they're all PR bots. So it's good to see a bit of personality from them.
Yeah. I don't know. You can draw your own conclusions about what you think of Kevin Magnussen based on what he said, but him actually saying what he said, I don't have a problem with it.
All right, what have I got here? I've also got teammates playing swapsies. So we'll start with the little one, which was Palmer just moving out of the way for Hulkenberg. A team instruction, I'm sure. And if he wasn't so desperate or if he wasn't, probably feeling the breath of a pole on the back of his neck, he probably would have argued that one a little bit more than what he did. But yeah, and I think you mentioned, Luce, that the gap that Hulkenberg put on Palmer after that, just to reiterate that.
Yeah, it was just 19.2 or something seconds in 25 laps.
That's pretty crazy, Matt.
Not a small margin, is it? And I think I was watching the rest progress during the race to see how close he was to Stroll, and I think before they started getting lapped and things like that, he was only 5 seconds off him. So
yeah, I think Di Resta said after the race. I've got a note here about Di Resta. Was that his biggest problem was his spatial awareness. So as soon as he got around cars, he was losing a lot of time because he doesn't really know these cars to be around other cars.
Yeah, my point being that Palmer really shouldn't have dropped that sort of time to Hulkenberg, given he's driven all year and he's supposed to be driving for his life. So, the writing's on the wall with Palmer. It's just whether they boot him now or they boot him at the end of the year.
Yeah, it's a matter of when, not if. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
does he find another home in Formula One, or is Renault going to be his one and only stop?
Does Sauber need the money?
No, they'll have Ericsson and Leclerc next year. That'll be Sauber's driver lineup.
Oh, there we go.
He might rock up somewhere if we get a new team in Formula One in a couple of years and he's still got the cash. Or he'll be in another racing series like Formula E or something like that.
Or he might be a reserve driver or something. Test driver.
Yeah, maybe a reserve driver. I doubt we will see him in a top Formula One team or even a midfield Formula One team again.
It's strange to think that he's, at the moment he's a manufacturer driver because he just seems so out of his depth compared to his teammate.
Yeah, he was at Lotus.
Yeah. Oh, I know why he's there. It's just strange.
When they weren't, yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we mentioned Di Resta through all of that. What did you make of his performance? Was he nothing more than a somewhat adequate sub, or were you actually really impressed with what he did, Matt?
Bit of both, actually. I think he to jump in qualifying and only be whatever he was, 7 or 8 tenths, I think.
Well, he got within 107% rule, right?
Yeah, and he was he 7 tenths behind
Yep, about that.
behind Stroll
In qualifying. Let me just double check here. I've got the numbers here.
Yeah, 7 tenths.
Stroll on a 19.1, De Resta on a 19.8. Yeah, 7 tenths.
Yeah, I think that even coming from karting and knowing what it's like jumping in when you haven't driven for a couple of weeks, and to do 11 laps and be within 7 tenths of your own best, let alone somebody else's best. So I'm really impressed with his qualifying performance. And then in the race, I guess, you know, it's hard when you're in one of the not best handling cars of the weekend, and yeah, the spatial awareness thing with a wide car that he's never driven, and switches he's never done, and tires he's never managed, and you know, the list goes on.
Fuel loads he's not been on.
Yeah,
And tires
well.
he'd never run before.
I think what will count against him with this comeback was the competitiveness of the car more than the job he did. It looks like he did an adequate job at best because the car was a dog this weekend.
Yep.
If the car was as good as it was in Baku and he jumped in, we could get a bit more of an idea of what kind of a job he did. But you know, being lapped, first person lapped because the car's been a dog, and then he dropped like a stone after that.
He certainly proved himself as an adequate reserve driver, at least. Like he's sorry, I shouldn't say adequate, as a really good reserve driver, that he is capable of getting in the car, not throwing into the barrier, and you know, as I said, getting through the 107% rule. Not every driver and not every Formula One, not every driver hanging around a paddock would be able to do that.
Yeah, it's better to judge him off his qualifying performance, to be honest, and that was quite impressive.
And what
the very little time he had.
Yeah, what do you make of it, Luce?
Yeah, it was a pretty good effort because obviously he'd not driven like these. Well, he hasn't driven in 3 years or something like that. So he's never driven sort of really these power units. Never been on the tires, fuel loads, all that stuff, and then to just jump in qualifying and be as close as he was a pretty damn good effort. And I think I reckon it sort of brings up a couple faults with the complete lack of testing that these guys do, and we've got half the teams don't have reserve drivers, and should, you know, something happen to one of the teams without it, like, who are they going to get? They're going to draft in some kid to, you know, who's driven the car once or twice. Yeah. Like, I think there needs to be a little bit more freedom in terms of testing for these guys, I
think what sucks for the small teams is that if, or the midfield, the lower tier teams, is that if that happens to one of the top teams will take one of their drivers. So, yeah. You know, Red Bull would take Sainz, and, you know, Mercedes would probably take Ocon or Verline. Ferrari would take someone.
Gio went, after he did his time at Hungary, he went back to obviously Italy, so he would have been.
Yep.
He wouldn't have been able to go back. So Ferrari, like, it's a lot of teams are risking having just one car at a race.
It's all right, Luce. Jean was at the circuit.
I forgot about he would have showed him up.
It would have been unfair.
Yeah, that's it.
Do you subscribe to Kimi's theory that the rest should stick to reporting?
Probably. I mean, we've seen enough of him and his disdain of front wings over the years.
All right. Well, the last thing I wanted to bring up with the race is obviously the biggest thing that really came out of the race, even bigger than the Verstappen-Ricciardo crash, was the consternation that came out when Bottas firstly allowed Hamilton to pass him in the latter part of the race to chase down Kimi and Seb, and then obviously at the last corner of the last lap where Hamilton pulled over to let him go back through. Now, my view on that is that Hamilton 100% did the right thing, because that's how teams operate. And if you make a agreement with your teammate like that, car to car, then you stick to it. And so good on him for doing that. But there was a lot of consternation in the British press about, could that cost Hamilton the championship, blah, 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 blah. And so what I wanted to say is from our counterpoint, and we're not always the nicest people to Lewis Hamilton, but I thought he 100% did the right thing, Lewis. So what do you think?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. I don't imagine him doing it last year or when he had even Jensen. I don't think he would have done it if Jensen was his teammate.
Well, you say that. I don't remember so much being made out of it when Rosberg pulled out of his way at Monaco last year.
Well, I said to you, I can't remember if it was yesterday or after the race, but I think a lot of the British press forget that if Rosberg doesn't let Hamilton buy at Monaco, he doesn't win at Monaco last year. Like, Ricciardo wins that race.
Yep.
So I think that the British press in that respect have got to shut up a bit. And, of course, Heike let him go 50 million times at Germany in 2008. But, hey, we'll just let that slide.
and Matt, so I think it's important, particularly for, for Hamilton in the battle that he's up against. Is this going to be a case of paying it forward? Is he banking on keeping Bottas on side? Because they may very well need each other later in the season, depending on who's in contention. And obviously that's more likely to be Hamilton at this very moment. Is it a good idea to not rub your teammate the wrong way in case you need to get him to politely shift out of your way to win a championship later on?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. He needed to give the place back for that reason. And to avoid all the other questions that would have gone with it, not just on his side, on Mercedes' side too, which I'm still asking the question because Toto Wolff after the race was saying, I'm not, I'm uneasy with the decision because we might lose the championship by 3 points, blah blah. But I don't get how the race ball he can say, we're favouring both drivers equally, and then say swapping means that they could lose the championship by 3 points, forgetting that Bottas got those 3 points and not another team. So, are they really in it for both of them, or are they just in it for Hamilton? They were Bottas's 3 points. They were his 3 points.
And Bottas as well in contention. Like if you look at the driver standings, Bottas is now 19 points behind Lewis in the championship.
Exactly. So what if Bottas wins the championship by 3 points? What are they going to say?
And Bottas
we swapped them back, eh?
And Bottas has a DNF up his sleeve. So
yeah. He's doing a good job. He's doing a good job. And if Bottas does win the championship by 3 points, it's like that's a stupid logic. It's a really stupid logic for a team that is supposedly backing both drivers equally to win the drivers' championship.
All right. Well,
doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I'm going to say is that I also thought that what Hamilton said after the race was spot on, and and hats off to him when he said that if he wins the championship, he wants to win it the right way. He doesn't want to win it by screwing over Bottas. He doesn't want to win it by, And I think that maybe it goes a little bit unsaid sometimes. That obviously the relationship between Hamilton and Rosberg was really toxic to the point where Rosberg left the sport after winning the championship because he didn't want to go through that again. I wonder, do you think that had any effect on Hamilton? That champion, like those battles with Rosberg, like is the Hamilton this year more likely, looking for just a harmonious team, and that's the biggest thing that he wants is just a team he can operate in rather than a team he feels like he's fighting a war in. What do you think of that, Lewis? Do you think he's changed, or was he just did his battle with Rosberg not affect him at all?
It might have affected him a little bit, but I think it's more the fact that I think he's just more confident that he can handle Bottas and what he could Rosberg. I think Rosberg for him was an unknown, and it scared him a bit, which led to him being a little bit more erratic and a little bit more aggressive at times. While with Bottas, I think he knows that he's faster than him and that, he should put him away 9 times out of 10.
What do you... Yep.
But yeah.
I was just going to say, and what do you think, Matt? You've been obviously following Hamilton closely since, probably prior to 2007. So, what do you think? How do you rate him this year? Is he a little bit of a softie this year?
Yeah, he's definitely. I wouldn't say he's being any softer than he was with Heike. But you saw whenever he was up against a tough teammate like Nico, like Jensen, you're not doing anyone any favors. So I think he had that 3 years, 4 years with Nico where they were tearing shreds off each other at every opportunity. To have some calm in the team this year, he definitely didn't want to destroy that, and it was better for him to move over. So yeah, for sure he's being a lot softer this year than he was in the last couple of years. But I agree with Lewis. It's because he feels that he's got Bottas covered a lot better than he had Nico covered. So there's no need to step it up in how he plays the game like he did with Nico or Jensen. It's more of the approach he used with Heikki.
No worries. And what do you make of teams doing that thing where they're saying, okay, so you let Lewis through if he can't catch, get him back, let him back through later. Is it smart, or is it the antithesis of racing when you're deliberately letting somebody through, Matt?
I reckon it's good because it builds trust in your drivers that you're gonna, when you do respect what you've said, like what happened at Mercedes on the weekend. It builds trust in your drivers and binds the team together, binds your two drivers together who can trust each other a bit more. And otherwise, you do what Force India did and don't let anyone pass anyone, or don't let anyone do anything, and you see what happens between those two now. Every opportunity they're side by side, they're throwing each other off the track. So I think it's better for the team spirit and to bind the team together to let one, or to put that position forward at the very least, and then it does give the team the best chance of the best result. So there's no negative in it for me.
And what do you think, Lewis? Is it better for us fans to see that? Gives us more chance of a battle on track?
Well, that's it. I mean, obviously we saw it at Canada where for countless laps the Force India should have swapped over and they didn't do it, and then in the end it cost them. And then obviously we saw here, like, if things had stayed the way they are, the Ferraris would have had, been comfortably out in front, while, the Mercedes swapped their drivers and Hamilton went at it for a few laps, and it was really tense for up until the last couple laps. So as a team, it's the right idea. Obviously, with drivers, it builds trust with the team. Like if one driver lets the other guy go and then they swap it back again, obviously it builds trust between the two drivers that, okay, when it's the other way around, they'll let me go and battle the guy in front, and then the team's happy with the drivers. So it's a win for everybody as far as I'm concerned.
Very good. All right. Well, we've hit our hour. I had one more thing on the list, but I think we might save that for a fortnight's time. That's right, folks. You heard correctly. We're not taking a summer break, or winter break as it here is in Australia. We're going to be back in a couple of weeks' time to discuss the future of the sport and just general shenanigans with a lot of information about next year being released. The last note I had was about the Halo, so we'll push that into episode 7, where we'll go in depth with what we think is current. The sport's certainly a lot better this year than what it has been, but there's still some things that I think they should work on. And I think to understand how I feel, you only need to listen to Christian Horner from Hungary. But what we'll do now is just grab some final thoughts from these two guys before we have a fortnight off about the Hungarian Grand Prix. To you, Matt, what are your final thoughts about what you saw in Hungary and what you think of what's left of the season ahead?
Good news for the championship that Ferrari were able to win, and not only win but show that they were the best car during the weekend, which they really needed to. So that bodes well, at least for probably half the tracks that are going to come later in the year, and ensures that we're not going to get a Merc wash to the end. So title should go down to the wire. And then going into Spa, it'll just be, I think Spa will be the point where we start to see things unfold for 2018, whether it be drivers, engine, little things like that. So that'll go nicely with the the championship fight to the rest of the year.
Very good. And Luce, what are your final thoughts from Hungary and looking ahead at the immediate future of Formula One?
Well, it was obviously great to see Ferrari win, and obviously it keeps the championship interesting for the rest of the season. Obviously we'll start finding out obviously where the drivers are going to be, but I can't wait for the collective groan from the Formula One community as Kimi Raikkonen gets announced for 2018.
So that's beautiful because you've segued directly into my final point. So my final point was that I got to say I finished a Hungary and I was frustrated for Kimi Raikkonen. He's had a couple of really good races in a row. He had a good race at Silverstone, particularly qualifying. He could have been on pole at Hungary. He's been doing a good job, but he could get to the end of the year without a win, which would be frustrating because I feel like he's, since Monaco, he's been certainly much more competitive.
Yeah, certainly robbed at Monaco.
Sorry.
Yep.
They shafted him.
Yeah, team shafted him.
But I do hope that at least some point this season, Kimi can snag a win. We know he's a little bit of a Spa specialist, hey Luce. And
I wish people would stop saying that.
And obviously, he had good qualifying at Monza last time out. So even though he's last by turn one, so we'll wait and see. But I do really hope that Kimi can snag a win because I felt frustrated for him. Felt like he's been performing really well. So thanks for joining us this evening. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with episode 7 to discuss the sport whilst everybody else is on holidays. So be sure to join us then.